I'd like to introduce Rafael Chacon. Rafael was born in Cuba, and he came to the United States in 1970. He told me he was the October missile crisis baby. He was an employee of the, you taught for 7 years at the Chicago Art Institute, or were you a student? You were an employee of Chicago Art Institute, a place that I used to patronize. I grew up in Illinois, and I remember going to Chicago there. He has been an art professor at the University of Montana since 1994, and starting in 2019, he became the new director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. And in this tenure, he spearheaded the construction of the fabulous new building that you all know is on campus, and I hope you've all been there. I was just there yesterday. He was leading a Mali class on in-depth look at how we have a very modern, professional, and fantastic museum with a collection that's the envy of many, many people. If you have not been to the MMAC, you owe it to yourself. So he has been the director there, and it is a fantastic place. He's very much of a scholar, and I would say a Renaissance man. He speaks 7 languages. And
depends on the language. No Chinese, no Russian.
What are the 7 languages, Rafael? Okay. And he can pronounce them with fluency, which always impresses me. I took 4 years of French, and I can't, anyway.
On that first screen, I clearly can't spell Montana.
Ooh, look at that. Rafael has a microphone on his person, so thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So yeah, I almost started talking about how history moves slowly or history moves quickly, and you guys are proof that history moves very slowly. When are you guys going to get to the 21st century? I mean, 1812, 1830, 1908. You're moving at a good clip here. Okay, so Lee, you were going to read the title of my talk.
I forgot to announce your title. He wanted to make sure I did that. Please forgive me. Art, Politics, and Ideology, Some Case Studies.
Right. So that's the big rubric. But obviously, I'm not going to talk about some case studies. I'm going to talk about one case study, because I think this is a very interesting case where those ideas of art and politics and ideology come together. And and it's also a topic that I don't think gets a whole lot of currency, because when we talk about revolutions in France, we always think of 1889. We think of the French Revolution. But of course, the 19th century France was riddled with revolutions, convulsive revolutions. And this one, the Revolution of 1830, is actually quite interesting. And from the perspective of the visual arts, it's really paradigmatic. It's a very, very influential and important moment in French history. So that's what I'm going to be speaking about tonight. So you all know, you've heard the story of the famous Bastille, the prison that was in Paris, that was stormed, in 1889, and they opened the gates, and they finally pulled down that prison. And there is a square, the Place de la Bastille in Paris, and there's this enormous column there, and everybody who walks there thinks that that column commemorates the French Revolution, but they don't know which revolution it commemorates. It has nothing to do with the Great Revolution of 1889. In fact, what it marks, or 1792, what it marks is the Revolution of 1830, which is known as the July Revolution, because it took place on these great days, the 28th, 29th, and 30th of 1830, the 3 glorious days, as that revolution is called. And by the way, that revolution is known with a number of different names. It's sometimes called the Glorious Revolution, or sometimes called the July Revolution. And the monarchy that came into power at that point is known as the July Monarchy, because of those 3 days. So So this work of art, which is it's in every textbook of Western art history. It is in every book. Everyone thinks that this painting is about the French Revolution. It is not that revolution. It's this revolution. It's the revolution of 1830. And so it is indeed a paradigmatic painting. It's an allegory of Lady Liberty. Her name, by the way, is Marianne. I don't know why they call her Marianne, but anyway, Liberty in France has a nickname, Marianne. And there she is leading the masses bare-breasted. Why? Because she's French. And with her little red cap, which is a symbol of democracy. And what you see, of course, is the rabble, the mob, the French people rising against tyranny and rising against monarchy in hopes, in expectations that what would follow would be true democracy. And of course, you know that the first revolution ended in a bloodbath, and it was never institutionalized, and it ended actually in tyranny. It didn't end in democracy as it was the promise of that revolution. It ended in the tyranny of Napoleon Bonaparte, which was then followed by monarchy for a long time. And actually, in this revolution in 1830 promised democracy yet again, some 40 years after the first democratic revolution. And it didn't deliver, actually, which is the kind of sad story about this painting. But we see all the trappings here of democracy. We see, in fact, the people, and we see them in all of their rough and rustic and tumble, qualities. So we see young boys, old men, everyone wielding a saber and killing the monarchists, basically. And of course, liberty is this kind of idea that is leading them, this woman. I think that we should replace the Statue of Liberty with that figure. How do you think that would go over these days with this administration? Not likely. But she also is wielding the flag. I love that. She's holding a gun in one hand, a rifle in one hand with a bayonet, and then she's holding the flag, the tricolore, which is the flag of democracy, which is, of course, the flag of the earlier revolution. So this is the man who was toppled in that revolution on those 3 glorious days of 1830. When the French people, starving, as they're prone to do, they were starving and wanted bread and wanted, and by now, think about it, in 1830, Paris was a very crowded, dirty, filthy city. It was Dickensian, to use Charles Dickens' allusion. It was, in fact, a kind of a fetid place, filled with formerly poor people from the countryside who had come there to work in factories and shops or whatever. And it's that rabble that rose up against this king, Charles X, who was a Bourbon king. And so this is a portrait of Charles X by a French painter by the name of Georges Rouget. And here is a sculpture. This is Sèvres, the famous porcelain house, did commemorative images of the king. And this was actually, he was the Count of Artois, so he wasn't king when this portrait was made. So this is Charles X, and he was actually toppled in this revolution of 1830. So the French had had enough of kings. I mean, and clearly after Napoleon, there was this idea that maybe the monarchy should be back in power, and it failed. It failed under Charles X. And I'm going to show you this other really interesting image because this is in some ways more accurate a depiction of that King Charles X. So we see him here walking with his grandson. He was sort of a Joe Biden kind of figure by the time he was toppled in 1830. So there we see him walking, and I love the caption under this. I mean, there's this huge cannon and all these cannonballs in front of it, and the little boy saying, "Grandpa, what do you call these big balls?" There's a joke there. Okay. But this is an image that's meant to satirize the king and emasculate the king, right? At some level, they're making fun of his manhood or his lack of manhood. Okay, so what I'm going to show you next are some images of that revolution of 1830. So these are paintings. They come from France. They're history paintings. And they tell the story from both the left and the right. But mostly they tell the story from the left, that wanted democracy and supported this revolution and wanted, in fact, to topple this King Charles X, who they felt had failed them, and they felt that the institution of monarchy had failed them. And what they wanted was a republic, a true French republic based on equality, fraternity. Well, what's the famous phrase? Liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? Liberté, égalité, fraternité, the motto of the French Revolution. So here we have this painting by Gabet, and this is the Revolution of 1830. And as you can see, this is what the French typically did in times of revolution. They pulled up the cobblestones and they started throwing them at the soldiers, at the army. And they threw out the furniture out of the windows, and they created barricades to prevent the army from moving in and out of the city. So this is, in fact, a typical scene of French Revolution. This is what happened in the late 18th century, and it's what happens again in 1830. And here's another scene by the same artist, and this is, again, another scene from the French Revolution. This is actually showing it from the side of the monarchists. So there are all the soldiers, the government soldiers, facing the mob on the other side of that barricade. Okay, so here's a print, actually, of the same of this revolution. This one actually is on the 28th of July, and this is an artist by the name of Hofbauer, who was probably a German working and living, or a descendant of Germans living in Paris. But what's interesting about this is there's the Seine River, and there's this bridge that goes over the Seine to the Ile de la Cité, which is the heart of the government in France. And that's, of course, where the Royal Palace is, where the Sainte-Chapelle, the Holy Chapel is. And the most important building that you see here is this building here, and that is the City Hall of Paris, the Hôtel de Ville. And here it is on the right. It's this massive structure right here, kind of at the heart of the Ile de la Cité in Paris. And of course, you see the mob converging, and by the 28th, the mob had won this revolution. The soldiers had left, the king was exiled himself to England, and the mob now knew that they had the potential of creating a republic. They didn't. They failed yet again. And so actually, and here you see the same bridge that you just saw in that print in a painting by Hippolyte Lecomte, and this is called the Battle at the Porte Saint-Denis. And so this, by the way, this doesn't exist anymore in Paris. This is gone. There used to be an arch, a small bridge that went over the Seine, and that arch that led right to the plaza in front of the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. And so here you see a scene from the battle taking place. Now notice the date. This was done in 1886. So this was done a long time after that revolution took place, right? So the revolution was in 1830. This was 1886. So it's sort of aggrandizing the story much later in time. So what happened to this revolution? Well, they could not decide, the deputies, the politicians, could not decide whether, in fact, they were going to give up monarchy altogether and create a republic, or whether they were going to bring back some form of monarchy, some variation of monarchy. And the compromise that they struck is that they would elect a king. Now think about that. That's an absurdity. You don't elect kings, right? Well, in this country we might. But kings are born, right? Kings are chosen by God. At least that's they rule by divine right, right? They're not elected. Election is something that democracies do, and you don't elect kings in a democracy. You elect presidents, prime ministers, etc., but you don't elect kings. Well, the French elected a king, and that's the guy they elected on the left. And we're lucky because, photography was invented in 1834, 4 years after this revolution. So we actually have one of the earliest photographs as an image of that guy. And that guy was a man by the name of Louis-Philippe d'Orléans. So he came from the House of Orleans, a noble house. And in a minute I'll tell you more about this guy. But just think about the absurdity. The French have a revolution, the people expect democracy, and what they get is a king. They get that guy on the left there, Louis-Philippe d'Orléans. They elect a king. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And by the way, he was not king of France. He was elected king of the French. There's a difference, which means essentially he is there because the people want him there. The people elected a king. That's an absurdity. And by the way, and of course, this formula, this political formula, it really is a failure, was a failure then. And by the way, he was toppled in 1848 in the next revolution. Okay, so just like Charles X, the karma wheel turned and it hit him 18 years later. So he wasn't only in power for 18 years. This formula of the idea that a democracy can stomach a king is an absurdity. And I think today there's still some places around the world which are wrestling with this idea. England, for example, sees itself as a monarchy, right? But England is a very democratic society, right? It has a parliament, it has elections, and they agonize over this hybridity of having a king and being a Republican-style country as well. Thailand is like that. I mean, there's many countries in the world that still have a constitutional monarchy. They have a monarch in some shape or form, but they're not comfortable with this idea. And some people are because they want full-on monarchy. Other people are less comfortable with that. And there are Republicans who don't want it at all. And the French tried to strike a compromise here, and it was a compromise that just absolutely didn't work. Okay, so Louis Philippe actually came into power, and there you see this is a formal portrait of him done in 1830. And here I just want you to see the contrast between the reality on the left and the fiction on the right of who this man was and what he looked like. Okay? So part of the point of this lecture is to talk about how truthful is art. I mean, I've shown you all these images and you've believed them as if they were the God-given truth. That every single image that I've shown you so far is someone's take on this revolution, either from the left or from the right, in support of democracy or against democracy, in support of the rebels or opposed to the rebels, or in support of the king and his soldiers, etc. Every work of art is in some ways a story, and that story is a subjective story. Lee was just telling me how he struggles because he goes into the museum and he realizes everything in the museum is subject to subjective interpretation. Well, that's the nature of art. It is, in fact, some artist's notion of the truth. And so imagine that every work of art is in some level of fiction, a piece of fiction, including the photograph I just showed you, by the way. Okay? So let's talk about Louis Philippe. Who was he? So this is a portrait of him as a very young man. In fact, this portrait was done, I believe, well, it was done in 1817, so it was done 15 years before this revolution. And there we see him on the right, later in life, with his two brothers, and they were the Dukes of Chartres and the Duke of Nemours. So they were noblemen. He came from a noble house. So if I told you that Louis Philippe was actually a very interesting guy, I mean, he became a tyrant, and he became one of the most corrupt leaders of France in French history. No question about that. I would say it was a failed rule from 1830 to 1848. However, he was a very interesting person before that. During the French Revolution, the earlier one, he came to America. And you know who he hung out with? George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. So he knew Republicans. He knew democracy. He actually hung out with Indians. He and his brothers traveled all over the eastern seaboard and into the South and into northern Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and they hung out, they lived with Indians. Now that's kind of peculiar for a French aristocrat. Of course, you got to remember, had he stayed in France, he would have lost his head, like literally lost his head, right? Because it was indeed the French Revolution where regicide was in the air. I mean, so he fled to America. But in America, he hung out with people that we think of as good Republicans, right? People of democratic leanings and people who, in fact, made a successful revolution happen in this continent, something that the French were not able to do in their own country. So in some ways, he had some credentials for ruling as a good Republican, as a democratic ruler, even though he was a blue blood, even though he was an aristocrat and a nobleman, and eventually a king. Okay, any questions, by the way? Because otherwise, I'll just keep blabbing on here. Okay, so let's go back to 1830, and what I'm showing you here is the arrival of Louis Philippe, now Lieutenant General of the realm, at the City Hall in Paris in 1830. This was painted 7 years after the Revolution. So I'm going to ask you this question. Is this the way the event actually happened? What do you think? Does anybody suspect that there may be an ideological bias in this picture? What do you think? Yeah, I see a couple of heads going like this. Yeah. He pretty much. He looks pretty clean, pretty handsome. He's been cleaned up. The artist has cleaned him up. In fact, the artist has cleaned up the whole scene. I mean, this looks like, in fact, like everybody was thrilled that the guy had arrived in Washington. I mean, had arrived at the City Hall, at the Paris City Hall. So what we have here is we have the mob praising the man. And look at how svelte that king looks. I just showed you a picture of him in 1830. Okay, that is not him in 1830. Okay, or he's been on a weight reduction formula for a while. Okay, so the artist actually has made him, and he is the center of attention. He is the focus of the picture. Everything revolves around him on his steed. You know, he's like the champion riding in to save the nation, right? Pulled out of the wilds of America to come and save France from whatever. So here is another image of this is the interior now. This is a scene of the deputies begging him, please become our next king, right? And so here he is, and of course he's with his white pants holding, you know, his hand to his breast, you know, to his chest, saying, okay, I'll consider it. You're damn right I'll consider it. I'll be king, whatever it takes. So there he is, surrounded by the deputies. And of course, the flag is everywhere, blowing everywhere. Because that flag, red, white, and blue, says what? That I'm not a royalist. In my heart, I'm really a Democrat here. I really want to rule the country in a fair, egalitarian way for everybody. Right? That's what that flag supposedly symbolizes. So again, this is fiction. Okay, and this is fiction from him, from his regime. This is what he wants people to, this is the way he's rewriting the history, to make himself look like he's really wanted, needed, and he's noble in this cause. So the artwork is in fact ideologically biased from the right, from the most conservative sides of French culture that actually wanted this guy as the king. So this is happening inside the City Hall. And to then prove his credentials, he also gets all of these people to support how much of a Democrat he is. And so this is an incredible little print. And by the way, there are lots of versions of this image. But what this shows us is the meeting between Louis Philippe and the Marquis de Lafayette. Ever heard that name before? Aha. Now, why is the Marquis de Lafayette an important figure in American political history and in French political history? Who was the Marquis de Lafayette? Why do we name plazas and streets and schools and elementary schools all over America after that guy? Pourquoi? He came over, and what did he do? He helped us win the revolution. And by the way, what was his class? What class did he come from? He was a marquis, meaning what? He was a nobleman. He was a royalist. He came from that class, the 1% that ruled in France and owned everything in France. Remember, it's the generation that lost its head, literally lost its head in the guillotine. Marquis de Lafayette put his whole fortune and said, here, George Washington, here's my whole fortune. Use it and win this war against that English king, right? So he was one of the figures that made the American Revolution succeed. So when the Marquis de Lafayette embraced Louis Philippe on the balcony of the Hôtel de Ville in Paris, the city hall, and gave him a kiss, what was happening there? What did the mob think was happening?
Virtue signaling.
What's that?
Virtue
signaling, that's right. Louis Philippe needed that kiss. He needed that Elon Musk to kiss his cheek or his behind, right? So that the people would believe that he was what? A Democrat, that he was a Republican, that he believed in democracy. And so this is known in French history as the Judas kiss. Right? What do you think happened to the Marquis de Lafayette's credentials as a good Democratic individual. It tanked. We praise Lafayette like he was a hero of democracy. The French today think of Lafayette as mud. Why? Because he betrayed democracy. Now, there are French royalists, by the way, who still love Lafayette. But in France, Lafayette is a traitor to democracy. And that is the moment of his traitor. Yeah?
Did he really support?
He did. That was a French kiss. It is the French kiss of all time. Okay, but what you're looking at here, by the way, is a print. And Lee can tell you all about prints because he's one of the best collectors of prints in this town. His collection is better than the Montana Museum of Art and Culture's collection of prints. A print, what's the virtue of prints?
Multiplicity.
Multiplicity, meaning what?
Many copies.
Many copies of the same image.
Everywhere.
Are prints expensive?
And they're cheap.
The ones you buy are expensive, but are prints in general expensive?
At the time they're made, they're cheap, and everybody can look at them.
That's right.
Spread the word.
So what you're looking at here is a print. This is that era's version of a meme online. You know how cheap those images are, and they get reproduced 1 million times electronically over and over and over. You see it, you can't stop seeing it online or whatever. In the 1830s, that's how the print functioned. It was cheap and it was everywhere. And by the way, this is one of hundreds of images that showed Lafayette kissing Louis Philippe. The whole point of these prints was ideological, was to make a message known to this rabble, this French mob, that Lafayette had endorsed Louis Philippe, that Lafayette had actually changed his mind about monarchy, that some monarchs are better than other monarchs, and therefore he was going to support this monarch. He didn't like the English monarch, and he didn't like Charles X, but he liked this monarch. And so this print was widely reproduced, and for some people it was a great betrayal of the ideals of the French Revolution. And for others, they said, okay, let's give him a chance, right? And the print was successful because it promoted Louis Philippe as, in fact, a Democrat, which, by the way, he wasn't. The minute he came into power, he completely stripped France of its powers, the French people of the rights, like freedom to gather, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. All those things went away, like overnight. He became, like every other French king, a dictator, right? That's what a king does by definition. So anyway, Louis Philippe became, in fact, one of the pilloried, French history later will not be kind to either Louis Philippe or Lafayette. Anyway, this is another image of Louis Philippe. This is actually his leaving the city hall. So you see paintings of him arriving at City Hall, doing his thing, getting kissed up there on that balcony, and then finally leaving. And again, this is an image that is clearly in support of Louis Philippe. It's ideologically biased in favor of this compromised king. Okay, so things did not go well for this July monarchy, almost from day one. In fact, Victor Hugo's famous Les Misérables, right, the miserable ones, was set during what is known as the June Rebellion. So remember, we have the July Revolution of 1830, and then it's followed on June 5th to 6th, 1832, so 2 years into the rule of Louis Philippe, by another uprising in Paris, and that is known as the June Rebellion. And that was a brief but very, very bloody insurrection. So in 2 years, there was another revolution which he crushed, and he won that one. So imagine, he gets into power in 1830. 2 years later, the very same rabble who put him in power or allowed him to get into power will then, in fact, rise up. And Les Mis, hold on a second, Maria, I'm coming to you. So this story, which is so popular and so famous today, is actually about that uprising during the rule of, so the evil person in the story is Louis Philippe, the guy I was just telling you about. Maria, what's your question?
I just remember vaguely about Louis Philippe, it might have been one of his, or maybe he's called Citizen King.
That's his name. Yes.
You know, who pointed that and when, if it was from his teaching, Citizen King, or if it was the revolutionaries piece or past.
Thank you. for bringing that up. His name is, he was known as the Citizen King, right? And I'll tell you in a minute, and you preempted my next conversation. So beautiful job, Maria. You paid attention in your Stanford history classes. Okay, so he was indeed called the Citizen King. And in a minute, I'll show you why. Okay, so let's talk about this, the artwork that we've been looking at. So the official art is, in fact, typically, and in Western, and I'm not just talking about French art, I'm talking about Western European art history. Official art typically are images of military heroes, usually portraits, or they're history paintings that extol the virtues of that individual in a time of war or in a crisis. They're the saviors, they're the knights in shining armor, they're the guys on horseback. So whether we're talking bronze statues in a public park or these history paintings like the ones that I just showed you, official art is usually a very, very biased version of the story. And that's basically, its whole point is to say that the state, regardless of the nature of the government, the kind of polity, whether it's in fact a monarchy or a democracy, the hero is always elevated as the savior, right? And that's how official art works. Official art tend to be tools of the state or typically the political right, because it's mostly conservative forces that create bronze statues of their military heroes or their kings or their monarchs. And the whole point of the art is to legitimate or maintain their power and their status and their rule. That's why when we take down Confederate monuments, what we're actually saying is that they no longer have currency. They no longer have value. Their authority is gone. And that's why we melt them down. When you pull down a statue of Saddam Hussein, what you're basically saying, that official art is no longer official. It is, or that's right, or Assad. I mean, we see this over and over again. Official art gets put up as long as that person is in power. And once the people pull it down or destroy this work of art, it's lost its authority. Or sometimes it loses its authority and then the art is gone. So, okay, so official art is a peculiar thing in Western art history. And by the way, we've had it since ancient Mesopotamia. I mean, we've had it since the ancient Egyptian. Art is propaganda, usually for the state, because the state has a lot of money to promote itself through works of art. Okay? So a statue of a pharaoh is meant to say the pharaoh is eternally in power, right? That's what it's for. And it tells the people that the pharaoh is bigger and better than you. Okay? The pharaoh is eternal, you're mortal. All right, so that's the way official art functions. Here's an example of official art. So this is the famous, well, you tell me what this is. The Arc de Triomphe, right? The triumphal arch in Paris with this beautiful star-shaped pattern, this urban pattern. By the way, this only came into being after Napoleon fell from power, after 1815. So what you see here is, in fact, a monument that actually commemorated Napoleon's victories long after Napoleon was defeated. So this whole thing is about memory. It's about nostalgia for the great power of Napoleon. And by the way, you know who finished this? Louis Philippe. So this was begun by Charles X in the years after the collapse of Napoleon as a monument to Napoleon, but it's Louis Philippe who erected the sculptures that you see here on it today. The image, the famous image of Napoleon on there, was placed there by Louis Philippe. He was there at the ribbon cutting when they opened the Arc de Triomphe. Now, why would Louis Philippe honor Napoleon Bonaparte? Think about ideologically, why would this become the official state art? Any of you been there? You've been there? Inside it, you know, there's all the names of all the victories of Napoleon, you know, all the towns he conquered, all the places where he went and conquered, and he expanded the French Empire, right? Why would Louis Philippe want to honor Napoleon Bonaparte? He sees himself in the same image. He wants to extol a previous tyrant because he himself is a tyrant, right? He's going to use the old man's reputation to better himself, to be seen in a better light. Was Napoleon noble? Was Napoleon an aristocrat? No, Napoleon was a commoner. So Napoleon was a commoner who came to great power and became a tyrant and became a leader of the French. Louis Philippe sees himself as a citizen king, as one of everybody else, because I was elected by the people. I'm not a nobleman. Forget that I'm a nobleman. If Napoleon could rule France as a commoner, I can rule France because the people want me here. That's the argument. And so he's grafting his own legacy on top of Napoleon's legacy. He's the one who finishes this monument. So this is really not a monument about Napoleon as much as it is a monument to Louis Philippe. Think about it. He, in fact, builds this monument, finishes this monument to aggrandize himself in his rule, in his time. All leaders, by the way, glom on to earlier leaders in time and bring them up, they elevate them to aggrandize themselves. They associate themselves with a previous leader. For example, President Trump, when he was first elected, he took the images of Martin Luther King from the Oval Office, put those away, put them in the closet, and he put up pictures of Andrew Jackson. It wasn't Washington or Jefferson in the Oval Office, it was Andrew Jackson. Why Andrew Jackson? First common man president, the wild guy. You guys know what happened at his inauguration, right? I mean, they ransacked the White House. Because President Trump identified himself with the rule of Andrew Jackson. I bet you Jackson will be back in the White House. Okay? So I'm talking about official art. When somebody is in power, they will create art that extols their virtues, raises them up, and even sometimes when they're praising previous rulers or previous leaders. Okay, so the political cartoon is typically anti-establishment. It doesn't come from the right because it doesn't have any money. The political cartoon is, in fact, what you see in the newspapers and in the magazines. And it typically is, in fact, against the establishment. And in the case of Louis Philippe, it is against the state, and it is against the power of the state, and it is against the king, and it is against monarchy. It comes from the far left. So you have the far right represented by official art, the state, the king, the monarchy, and the far left is going to wield a different weapon, a different artistic weapon, and that's the political cartoon. So the interesting thing is that lithography was invented in the early 1800s, and as opposed to another form of printmaking, which is etching, which is the way print or wood cuts, lithography is very fast. Lee, can you tell us why lithography is faster than etching?
You do it on stone.
Mm-hmm.
It's the repulsion of ink and oils.
Mm-hmm.
And you can produce many, many copies so that it doesn't wear out.
Okay, so first let me tell you a little bit about wood cuts. Somebody has to sit there and carve every single little line in order to make a block, and then that gets printed, inked and printed, right? That's a wood block. And etching, you take a metal plate and you have to do the same thing, carve it up, carve out all the lines, and then it gets etched in acid, and then it gets rubbed, you wipe off the acid, you put the ink on it, then you print it. Both of those are very slow, tedious, laborious processes. Lithographs are made with a stone, and you literally draw on the stone with a waxy stick, right? And then you ink that, and then you print it. And then that night, and then you print 1,000 images. It's very, very fast. And then that night, you rub off all that stuff, and the next day you do another lithograph. And so lithographs look like drawings because they are done very, very quickly. So lithography, in fact, improves. By the time 1830, lithography was the common way of making a political cartoon. So think about it. Oil paintings, bronze statues, marble statues are laborious. Official art tends to be made of that stuff. The print is fast. It's a lithograph, and it comes off the press every single day. And by 1830, by the way, the French, their literacy rates were going up. They were urbanizing. They were moving from the countryside in huge numbers. They were concentrating in the city, in Paris. And they were learning to read and write. And they were learning two things. They were learning words. They were learning how to read words, but they were also learning how to read pictures. And where did they do most of their learning? By grabbing that cheap penny newspaper on the street, which was a lithograph. Often it was just a picture with a few words at the bottom. And somewhere between the picture, often satirical, often a cartoon, and the words, they got the message. And usually the message was an attack on the king, or attack on the deputies, an attack on the government, or attack on the military, an attack on the people in power. That's how the political cartoon functioned in France. By the way, the political cartoon was invented not in France, it was invented in England. And it quickly spread to the United States. So in the late 1700s, we saw plenty of political cartoons during our revolution. And and then once lithography was invented, then it really takes off. And it takes off in France, and particularly by the 1830s. So some of the famous English artists are William Hogarth, Thomas Rowlandson. You might recognize these names. In France, in the 1830s, the most important name is Honoré Daumier, D-A-U-M-I-E-R. This is the guy right here. There are a few others. Some of my favorites are like a guy named Philippon, Gavarni. These are also great printmakers, but we know them less because they were not as productive as Daumier. And in the United States, Thomas Nast is the famous cartoonist in this country that did political cartoons mostly from the left to criticize the far right, and in this case, criticize monarchy. This is Daumier. This guy was a genius. He was an amazing artist, but he was a populist. He was a low-grade artist, and he worked mostly for the press. He worked mostly for the leftist press that hated Louis Philippe, that hated monarchy, and supported democracy in France. So he spent 18 years drawing cartoons against Louis Philippe, this king, and against this regime that was dictatorial, that was tyrannical, and very much opposed to the common people. What Daumier did was to support the common people, and he did it through his art and cartoons like this one. So by the way, originally this was in black and white. These cartoons were printed cheaply. They were drawn on a stone, and then they were printed in newspapers, and they appeared every single day. There was a new Daumier cartoon out, showing you the political chaos of France during the July Monarchy. The prints, by the way, were often, because they were so good, they were often collected, and it was a nice thing for women to do later times, to color cartoons, color these prints. So this is a hand-colored image, often done by children or women, which, you know, in the French mind, those were comparable. So, come on, people, rise up, protest. But this art is, in fact, leftist art, opposed to the king, opposed to the July Monarchy, and it's satires. And by the way, those are Daumier's initials, Honoré Daumier. And by the way, I love using that word in this building. Remember Honor? The woman who's responsible for this building? Yes. Honoré was his name as well. Honoré Daumier, the artist. So here, for example, this is about the wars, the king's wars. The king was fighting wars all the time, by the way. So it's like liberal wars. Kss, Pedro, kss, Miguel, kss. I mean, he's making fun of the Spanish kings, and there they are shown as these brats, you know, or these rivals for the Spanish throne. And there's Louis Philippe picking one over the other, encouraging, whatever. Louis Philippe is the guy in the top hat over there in the corner. Okay, so now I'm going to go this guy over here in the waistcoat and the top hat. And now I'm going to go back to Maria. Oh, this guy represents the French in North Africa, because France had colonies in North Africa. So.
The roseate is what I was trying to say. On the top.
Oh, it's a fez. But it's not the Marianne's Democratic hat, by the way. It's a different hat. This is a fez. You know, like.
No, the roseate.
Oh, the rosette. Okay, I'll come to it. I'm going to get back to Maria's question of why the nickname Citizen King. This is the king right here. Is he dressed like a king? What's he dressed like? He's dressed like an English businessman, like a banker. And they say that Louis Philippe, because he was a populist, he would walk the streets of Paris at night with an umbrella and a top hat, like an Englishman. So in his mind, he was a Democrat because he walked every night in the streets of Paris. Kings don't walk the streets, right? And he dressed like a common man, like a businessman, with the suit and the hat. So Daumier is actually making fun of him. The little rosette that you pointed out is that, see that little thing on his hat, on his top hat? He's often shown wearing it on his breast or on his hat. It's in the colors red, white, and blue. A little ring of red, white, and blue, like a little flower. And basically, that was a symbol during the first French Revolution of democracy. So he is parading as if he were, in fact, a Democrat by wearing that garb and that little rosette in the hat. Okay, here's another image of Louis Philippe, according to Daumier. It says, "We are all honest men." And what you see are the judges of the Supreme Court, some of the deputies of the Congress, and there is the king embracing his fellow politicians. And what are they doing to each other? They're picking each other's wallets. They're fleecing each other, right? So that, by the way, this is Louis Philippe right here. This guy, the big guy, okay? So, Daumier is a satirist. Daumier is, in fact, poking fun at the deputies and the lawyers and the Supreme Court and the king. And he's treating the king just like anybody else. He's not extolling the virtues of the king. He's not putting him up on a pedestal. He's, in fact, treating him as a common man. And that's what we see here. As a common corrupt man. Every single day there was a new cartoon parodying the king, satirizing the king. So always from the left, always against the monarchy and always against the king. Here, for example, this is the London conference, which took place a few years into his rule, so 2 years later. And these are all the politicians, the European politicians gathering in London. This is Louis Philippe over here on the right, shown as a rabbit, a bunny rabbit, right? And notice he's wearing the little rosette, or the cocarde. They often call it the cocarde, the red, white, and blue. So the other ones, you know, the monkey, the horse, they represent different nations of Europe meeting in London. Okay. Who is the woman on the ground? That's Lady Liberty. So that's Marianne, sweet Marianne. By the way, let me tell you something about the famous painting of Liberty leading the masses. You know, I began by showing you with her bare breasts and the flag or whatever. Louis Philippe bought that painting out of the Salon in 1830. He bought it. And you know what he did with that painting? He shoved it in a closet. It didn't see the light of day until 1850, till he was gone. Now it's, of course, in Paris, and everybody goes to see it, and everybody bows in front of it or whatever. But Louis Philippe couldn't stomach that painting because it was, you know, it's the mob, it's the rabble, it's about liberty, right? It's not about him. Anyway, that's supposed, they're trashing. Actually, it's not Lady Liberty, even though it looks like Lady Liberty. This is Poland. She represents Poland, the nation of Poland. But it's like as if liberty were, in fact, being crushed by the states of Europe. Poland, by the way, is always being beaten up. I mean, we could be talking World War II and Poland would be lying on the ground as well. So, okay, so I want to go back to Daumier, this French artist. Daumier was a very astute politician himself, and he stalked the politicians. And he did it in a very clever way. They say that he would go into the parliament every day to hear the deliberations of the deputies, too many D's in that sentence, the deliberations of the deputies, with a ball of clay in his pocket. And he would sit there sculpting them. So, and he did that. He sculpted the entire legislature in these, and so he'd leave there with a sculpture of these guys, and then he'd use that as a cartoon. He was satirizing them by creating cartoons. Now, the cartoon, what makes it a cartoon? Is a cartoon an accurate portrait of somebody? Caricature. It's a caricature. It's, in fact, the word caricature is like the French caricature. Charles Baudelaire, the French writer, said that the power of the caricature is that once you see it, you can't erase it. So think about it. If I showed you a president who does this, who am I imitating? Tricky Dicky, right? Tricky. I mean, you can't erase that image of Nixon because he was caricatured once, and that's all it took. Forever he will be Tricky Dicky, right? Okay, so this is what he's doing here visually. This is one of his friends. This is Philippon, who was in fact a journalist, an artist, a guy who made prints every day against the king, but he also gets satirized too. This is actually a tiny little sculpture. It's about this big, made out of a ball of clay by Daumier and hand-painted by Daumier. And that's his friend Charles Philippon. Now, Charles Philippon is really important because, well, and actually these, you see, these are all, this is the legislature. This is one of Daumier's most famous prints, and it shows the French legislature. These are your congressmen right here. The entire French Congress, there they are, caricature, satirized, each one like their worst features magnified. And that's the whole point of the caricature. You know, the guy who's always sniffling with his, you know, his hanky, the guy who's like blustering, the guy who's always asleep at every meeting. I mean, they're all there in their worst attributes, not their best attributes, their worst. Because, of course, that's the power of the caricature. That's how you remember who these people are. One of these guys, this one, I love this guy. This was the censor for the government who censored the newspapers and the magazines or whatever. Apparently had a very large beaky nose, right? Like a beaky nose, and there you see that beaky nose. So Daumier often showed him with a large beaky nose and a pair of scissors that was equally beaky, because all he did was cut out the text in the newsprint or whatever and censored the, so I mean, Daumier had a great sense of humor and the French public got it. Okay, that's the guy who censors your newspapers and censors your magazines. Everything you read is censored by him. Philippon, the man I just showed you in that little caricature, drew this image of King Louis-Philippe d'Orléans, and he actually devolved the king's face into the image of a pear. Do you see this? Well, actually, this is the way he published it in the cover of the Charivari, the magazine. So he shows you a portrait of the king, and then he slowly devolves it into a pear. Now, why did he do that? Well, he's playing on words. The word poire in French is another word for idiot. And so by representing the king as a pear, what he was doing is saying the king is an idiot. So the pear becomes then the likeness of the king, the caricature of the king. So much so that this is, for example, one of the king's legislative efforts, and there it is written out into the shape of a pear. And this was on the cover of the magazine Le Charivari. Again, one of these cheap printed magazines that would show up every day. Every single day, they would satirize the king. The king was PO'd, okay? And he put Philippon in jail for this because you could not depict the king in a bad light. It was against the law to criticize the king. If you criticized the king, you could wind up in jail. Philippon went to jail. And when he was at court, this is what he did. While the lawyers were arguing and debating whether he should be jailed for longer or he should be fined or whatever, where he was being judged, Philippon drew this little sketch. This is the actual page of what he drew. And this is what the jury passed around. And he said, isn't it logical? He just showed him. The king looks like a pear. Therefore, the king is a pear. Therefore, my image is not a lie. It is not a fiction. The king is a pear. That's basically what he's arguing. Anyway, they fined him, I think, 1 franc, and they let him go. But you understand what was happening here. The king actually was insulted by being parodied in this way. But that didn't stop the cartoonists, and it didn't stop the kids, because children started drawing pears on the sidewalks and on the walls of all over Paris. So the character stuck. This is an image of the king, not just in his head looking like a pear, but his body looked like a pear. And therefore, they had many ways of criticizing this king, and there you see it. Okay, so this is 1830, folks, but this doesn't happen today. This is old ancient history. That's the way it used to be done. These things don't happen these days. We do not parody our kings and our monarchs and our rulers. The caricatures don't stick any longer. You know, they used to, but they don't anymore. Lee, were you going to say something?
Yeah, how did Daumier escape the punishment that was meted out?
He didn't. He didn't. He went to jail. All of these leftist journalists suffered tremendously under this rule. They saw their newspapers' offices busted open. They saw the military destroy their offices, come destroy their press, their printing presses, and rip up their plates and confiscate their printing materials. They saw both the military and they saw the mob going in and doing this in the name of the king, in supposed defense of the king, even though they were being paid by the king, whatever. They went to jail under the draconian laws of this monarchy. It was a brutal state. In fact, this is an image done by both Granville and Daumier, and it shows us the king literally silencing that woman. And who is that woman? It's Liberty. You're in a studio of a leftist newspaper, and they're publishing their magazines, and inside, look at this guy holding scissors. You recognize him? There he is. There's the censor, there's the other deputies, and there's the king himself shutting her mouth, right? Basically saying, Liberty, shut your mouth. It's pretty potent stuff. So you can see, by the way, why the king was incensed with this kind of imagery, right? And you can also see the outrage of the press. And the press basically said, okay, we'll get you, king. You can go ahead and lock us up, but we will press you. Here you have the king literally being crushed by a printing press. So who is the hero in this image? The people, but specifically the printmaker, the graphic artist, the newspaper guy, the journalist is the hero here. Here is the hero. So it says, the caption reads, Liberté de la presse. So freedom of the press, basically. And the hero is the common man, right? And then you see there's the king here on the left. He's like, I'm gonna get you with my umbrella, basically. Parodying the citizen king. And over here, we have the old Charles X, who's like fainting. Like, what has France come to? Even the old kings are appalled by this. But in both cases, both the old monarchy and the new monarchy, it's the press who is the real hero here. Okay, so this stuff is as ideological as it gets. This is art being put into the service of political ideas, either from the left or the right. I like this one because this is called, oh, France is taking a break. So it's France taking a break. This king had to be exhausted, trying to fight his wars. Look, and by the way, there's Marianne again in the background, Lady Liberty. And here is the French cock. You guys know about the rooster that represents France? It's not morning in America. I mean, it's not morning in France. I mean, this rooster is dead tired, is what Daumier is saying. Okay, I'm going to show you this because Daumier was also very conscious that these were serious issues for France. So, and also, while he was in fact a satirist, a political cartoonist, and his stuff feels kind of tawdry in the end, like it's cheap, it's, like every day he was doing another cartoon, another silly cartoon, there were serious issues behind it. For example, this is a situation that happened in 1834. There was a massacre on the street, the street of Tansonen. And what happened is troops rushed into an apartment building and they murdered everybody looking for a revolutionary, a rebel. And they murdered all these civilians. And so this is Daumier basically doing serious art. The cartoon that morning wasn't a satire of the king. It was actually that image that you see there. And basically the message is, look at these innocents. I mean, every time you see a dead baby, you know you're being manipulated. Okay? So here you're being manipulated by Daumier, basically saying, look at how evil this empire is. Look at how evil this king is. Look at how evil the state is, that it would kill innocents in their bed, in their pajamas, to further their interests. So this is actually based on reality, on a real event that took place. But let me ask you the question, is this true? What's the truth of this? If the official art is a fiction, this is another version of fiction. This is, again, a subjective telling of the story. Only this is coming from the far right, the far left. It's empathic, it is supportive of the poor, it's supportive of the common people, but it is no less manipulative than the images that I showed you of Louis Philippe riding on his horse. So again, you just remember, art always comes with a point of view, and often it may not be the point of view that you believe in. But it's going to try its hardest, or the artist is going to try their hardest, to convince you that they're right, that their political ideas are the ones that have currency. So Daumier, I think here is arguing two things. One is that he cared for the poor, he cared for the dispossessed, he cared for the innocent. Yes. He's also telling us, I'm a damn good artist. I'm as good as Rembrandt. In fact, he's ripping off Rembrandt here. He's doing what artists did 100 years earlier with light and shadow or whatever to make this image look like a kind of Christ-like image, right? The dead person laid out with sort of this godly light falling on his body. I mean, he's suckering you into believing his version of the story. It's a very powerful print, yes, but it's also a very manipulative print, and let's admit it. Okay, this is another Daumier to show you kind of like the ilk. These are the dead waking up, and they're looking out at the mob, and it says, these are the dead who have died for liberty. And basically, these are the dead of 1830. What he's saying is like, look, all those people who died in that July Revolution died for this? I mean, that's the message of this print. Powerful stuff, but also manipulative stuff. This little painting, by the way, is in our collection here. And this is Daumier as well. He wanted to be seen as a serious artist, as an important artist, not just as a political cartoonist. So not only do we have hundreds of prints by him in our collection, we also have this little gem of a painting. And what this shows us is, in fact, it's called the refugees or the fugitives, the immigrants. We don't know what war this is. We know that this comes from later in his career, from 1852 to 68. So Daumier lived a long life. He actually outlasted Louis Philippe. So this was another revolution yet, that happens much later in time. We don't know what the context is for this little painting, what was actually happening here. But what we do know is that Daumier actually was sympathetic of the plight of the poor. And France was, with every one of these revolutions, there were thousands of people fleeing and losing their homes and moving and constantly being uprooted by the chaos, the political chaos of the country. So it's a very interesting little painting in our collection. And it actually has a couple of mates, a couple of images that it's been identified with. For example, there's this one, which comes from about the same time. So again, Daumier is arguing here that I am with the people, right? I support their cause. I've always been anti-monarchy and pro-republic. There's another little painting in the Minneapolis Institute of Art, which is very similar to ours. It's apparently a little bit later than ours, and it shows us the same theme. People leaving in large numbers. And again, we don't know where they're leaving, where they're going, what they're fleeing. More than likely, they're leaving France. They're leaving Paris. They're heading back to the countryside because the city is, in fact, so unstable during yet another revolution. So, and this is, of course, the next revolution happens after, this was painted in 1885, but in 1873, Germany invades France, another chaotic situation, another crown is toppled and another crown is elevated. This is actually the creation of Germany at Versailles Palace in France, official art. And I'm going to leave it here by showing you, in fact, how Daumier, for all of his the enthusiasm of those prints, particularly the ones that he did between 1830 and 1848, when he was, in fact, in direct and active opposition to Louis Philippe and his regime. Later, in the 1870s, when there is, in fact, another revolution and another king in power and another war, he is despondent. And I think you can see that in the later prints. So these are images from the 1870s. This one on the left is called The Other Candidates, and on the one on the right is called Monarchy. And I think you get very clearly his sort of viewpoint on the institutions of France. France is dead in his mind. As long as France is a monarchy, it is in fact a cadaver in his mind. And Marianne, sweet Marianne, the Lady Liberty, is basically just laid waste. And who are the other politicians? They're the crows and they're the vultures that are picking at her body. So he grows very despondent and very, sad for France, because France never really sees the promise of the French Revolution in the 19th century. What Daumier lived was, in fact, a century of war and chaos and the pendulum swinging in favor of republic against republic, and mostly under dictatorship. This is an image that I really I think it's a very, very powerful image. It comes from the end of Daumier's life. It's 1872, after the German, the battle, the Prussian-French War. And what it shows us, the dead pointing their finger at the Council of War. So this would be against the Defense Department, basically. So think about how important these political images that we possess today, they come from somewhere, and they come from this. They come from that generation and that power of artists using their art, their talents, in fact, to always call politicians on their decisions. So, Daumier at the end of his career. And I want to say that we in the United States were not immune to political cartoons. On the contrary, we had a robust, in the 19th century, we had also a very robust tradition of political cartoonery. So this is Thomas Nast, the great, and by the way, Thomas Nast admired Daumier, collected Daumier's prints, imitated Daumier's prints. And so sometimes Thomas Nast looks an awful lot like Daumier. But what this is showing us, this is called the American River Ganges, and it's showing us America defending itself against these creatures. Who are these creatures? Anybody want to decipher the politics here? You're all Americans. You should be able to decipher this one.
The church.
Which church? The Catholic Church. This is an anti-Catholic cartoon by Thomas Nast. It is showing all these papists washing up on American soil, right? And they're coming from the Vatican. That's that's the Vatican over there on the other side of the ocean. And they're coming to America. This is an anti-immigrant cartoon. In this case, the immigrants that those guys are opposing, those good white Americans, are papists from Catholic countries, like Italy, for example. So we have had our own version of political cartoonery, and we've also had our version from left and right, our own version of fictions and bigotries in our political dialogue. Okay, that's it for this conversation, and I want to open it up to some questions. Lee, is this okay? It's 10 after? Okay.
Oh, it's over here on the camera.
Oh, we have a microphone. Oh, by the way, it's keeping Catholics out of U.S. public schools. If you look at this, there's a school up there, and the American flag is hanging upside down, and it says U.S. public schools, and these are school children keeping Catholics out. Interesting, huh? Any questions or any comments?
Can you put up the very first slide?
Sure. The very first slide, okay. The very first painting. This one, okay. So this image would imply, because it's identified with the July Monarchy, that the July Monarchy was a good thing. But this image is too democratic for the July Monarchy, and that's why the king bought it and stored it, because he didn't want it to be seen. He didn't want the virtues, the values of democracy, of the first revolution to be a part of his regime. Anybody have any comments or questions? Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious, how did the people respond to the different kinds of art? I mean, he was in power for 18 years before there was a revolution, so they were buying it to a certain degree.
They were, yeah. And so initially, by the way, most of the cartoons that you see from, like, let's say 1830, 1831, 1832, they come from the left, and they're detractions of the king and the monarchy. But then what starts happening is you start seeing right-wing cartoons that favor the king and oppose the mob and oppose the rabble and oppose the press and oppose the left. So then what happens for the next 18 years is a kind of battle, an ideological battle, and it's a battle between newspapers and it's a battle between cartoonists, and you have the right-wing cartoonists and the left-wing cartoonists. Daumier, of course, belongs to the left-wing cartoonists. But there are equally important and powerful artists for the right who are defending the king. They had a harder time because, you know, the king was the king, and he was, in fact, doing what he was doing, and it was harder to defend the king through political cartoonery. So, but they went and attacked the leftists. They attacked the, you know, the mob. They attacked these guys.
So pretty divided society.
Very divided society, yes. Yeah, and that's the way, you know, if you look at 19th century French history, the pendulum is constantly swinging from the far left to the far right, and they can't get it settled. You know, they're on their third republic. What does that tell you? That two others have failed, right? So, and then in between, you've got monarchies, right? Multiple monarchies between those republics. So it's been a pretty dramatic history for France, not just in the 20th century. I mean, the 19th century, it's like, wow. It's chaos. Maria. Oh, was that a question?
They're on their fifth republic now.
They're on their fifth now?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I stopped counting.
So the ancient regime, then the First Revolution, First Republic, then Napoleon, the First Empire, and they had the restoration of the monarchy, then they replaced that with the other monarchy, which is what we've been talking about here. Mm-hmm. And then 1848, Second Empire. 1848, Second Republic.
Second Republic.
And then Napoleon III took that over.
That's right.
To be the Second Empire. And then you have the Prussian invasion, and then a little bit of the Paris Commune, and then the Third Republic. And then that lasted until the Nazis.
The Vichy regime of World War II.
And then in the 60s, there was a whole Algerian.
The crisis in Africa.
Yes, with what's his face? The guy, the World War II guy.
De Gaulle.
De Gaulle, thank you.
De Gaulle.
Yeah, and then that's when they went with the Fifth Republic. So, number 5.
5 republics.
Sorry.
Talk about political instability. It gives you hope for us. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, there's always hope, and somebody always has it worse than you do, right? Yeah. What about this issue of not trusting art? I mean, here I am, an art historian, and I'm telling you not to trust what you see because it's opinion. And just because it appears in oil on a canvas or it appears in print, you can't trust it because, of course, it comes from sometimes a very biased place.
Photography is just as biased.
Absolutely, yeah. And we tend to think of photography as, in fact, the truth, that somehow there's something veristic about that image. But photographers are as manipulative as anybody. And they begin with their selection, how they crop, what they just choose to put in, what they choose to leave out. I mean, I think, for example, of Ansel Adams waiting for the light to block off that scar on the landscape or that train track or whatever, so that the image that he can put forward is an image of wilderness in its purity, in a kind of eternal state, negating the fact that it's no longer pure, it's defiled by modernity and industry or whatever. So a photographer has as much power as a painter does to manipulate and shape the truth.
This might be slightly tangential, and I'm not sure I remember all the details, but just that, so Baron von Haussmann, I think it was after the 1870 and
after 1848.
Okay, I knew, I couldn't remember which revolution it was after, where it was like the city.
After Louis Philippe was toppled.
Okay, yeah, where the city was kind of devastated, and he's an architect, so it's kind of that, like, it's art, but it's functional art. It's that weird space that architecture exists in. And what he did in sort of revamping the city was make a lot of wide boulevards and knock down. And what you said about how the French always revolt by building barricades. They, rip up the streets and they throw furniture down. and they make barricades, and that was how they were able to stand against the soldiers to the extent that they were. And so I just remember in my French Paris history class that the idea was like he made all these big wide boulevards, and that made it harder for the people of Paris to rise up and revolt, because now it's like they don't have the landscape to do their barricades and stuff. And so that, I was just thinking of that as interesting if you take, because architecture is art. So there's like an artist who is, kind of working for the establishment, although it's interesting since it was after, that would have been during the Second Republic, I don't know, that, yeah, he's sort of working like an official art thing that is functionally, like not just sort of ideological, this is the message, but they making it functionally harder to resist the government.
Yeah. We think of the Paris, by the way, Paris is a modern city. Paris in the beginning of the 19th century was a medieval city with, crooked little alleyways and narrow streets and canals and all kinds of, and a very thick city wall around it. And it was a medieval city with medieval churches and medieval monasteries and cloisters, you name it. And, but after 1848, after Louis Philippe is toppled, Baron von Haussmann, it looks like Haussmann, but it's Haussmann, basically leveled the medieval city to create the modern city, the Paris that we love today, the Paris of the boulevards and the cafes and the beautiful parks. That Paris was a complete invention of the 19th century. And while we think of that as an aesthetic choice, that they wanted wide streets and they wanted tree-lined streets and they wanted, the great avenues that course through the city and angles and meet at stars at these roundels like the Arc de Triomphe, right? It was not an aesthetic choice. It was, in fact, a very practical choice. It was a choice to modernize the city and its infrastructure. And by the way, they wiped out the medieval city. Hundreds, thousands of buildings were leveled in order to create the modern Paris. So there is no medieval Paris. There are little chunks of it here and there, but it's mostly gone. What is there is a modern city with a modern infrastructure that looks to us aesthetically gorgeous and beautiful, but it also had incredible practicalities, including a military rationale for doing that. And that is that the French government would never see its army hemmed in between two barricades anywhere in that city. So it was an easy movement of troops up and down those streets. And then, of course, the Nazis figured, proved it beautifully when they rolled into the city and there was nothing to defend it, right? There was nothing there. It was just wide open. That plan was, in fact, a military plan as well as an aesthetic plan.
Could I close our session with the following observation and you respond to it? By the time the Impressionists came along, like about in the 1870s?
Yeah,
okay.
1873.
So they were taking up canvas and oil paintings, but they were not painting the histories, the historical events and the royalty. They were painting the common man. So was this like the next chapter of art?
Yes.
The ordinary artists were honoring the ordinary people on
That's
canvas.
Right. Absolutely.
Instead of on cheap paper that goes acidic and it's hard to preserve.
Crumbles.
And crumbles.
Yeah, that's right. Lee, you're absolutely right. The Impressionists were not at all interested in history paintings. They were not interested in extolling the great politicians and the gods and goddesses and the great heroes of French history. They were interested in painting the common man, the common world, the world around them, the real world as they saw it. And that's the power of Impressionism.
Well,
Can we get that lecture next?
I want to, on behalf of all the people here, I want to thank you, Rafael, for
Thank you.
fantastically interesting and erudite discussion of history and art in its intersection. And I feel sorry for the people that didn't fill up this room.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's cold.
They're
so
warm.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee.